Today, we're diving into a really cohesive and honestly pretty challenging worldview from Dr. Dennis Price. His big idea is that we all, and even entire civilizations, run on mental maps. But here's the kicker. What happens when that map is just wrong? When it no longer matches the real world, what he calls the territory?
So here's how we're going to break down his argument. First up, what happens when maps fail on a massive scale? Then, we'll look at the fault lines that crack open in our culture because of it. Third, we're going to deconstruct his pretty controversial idea of an architecture of grievance. And finally, we'll check out the new map he's proposing to fix all this.
Okay, so let's jump right in with the central idea, the big metaphor that holds this whole thing together. The author uses a truly catastrophic moment in history to show us exactly what happens when a brilliant leader is using a map that is fundamentally, fatally wrong.
We are talking about Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812. See, Napoleon had a mental map for war that was, up to that point, basically unbeatable. His strategy was simple. You fight a big, decisive battle, you capture the enemy's capital city, and then they surrender. Easy. But Russia refused to follow his map. They didn't play by his rules. And that turned his perfect map into an absolute death sentence for his army.
And the cost of using the wrong map? It was just staggering. We're talking about 1 million lives lost. The author's point here is that this wasn't just a failure of supply lines or getting caught off guard by the winter. No, this was the direct result of a certified genius clinging to his old map, even when the territory was screaming at him that it was wrong.
And this is what brings us to the key concept for this entire explainer: the map-territory fallacy. It's a really simple but powerful idea. It's the mistake we make when our model of the world becomes more real to us than the world itself. It's when we love our map so much that we stop looking at the actual territory around us.
And here's where Dr. Price really brings it home. He argues that Napoleon's blunder isn't just some dusty old history lesson. Nope, it's a flashing red warning light for right now. He believes that our own civilisational maps are dangerously out of date. And he says you don't have to look far for the proof. Just think about the 2008 financial crash. All these brilliant mathematical maps and risk models promised everyone they were safe, but they completely ignored the messy reality of how things were connected. Boom, global meltdown. Or think about the COVID-19 pandemic. Our preparedness maps were all built for the flu, but the territory, the actual virus, was something totally new, and our old maps were basically useless.
All right, so from historical disasters and financial crises, we're now going to go a layer deeper. Let's see how this whole map idea applies to the very scripts that define who we are, our cultures, and our religions. The author argues that these maps can also become outdated, and when they do, they create these deep, powerful fault lines in society that we often don't even understand.
So here's where the author makes a pretty bold, maybe even controversial claim. He says the whole concept of Judeo-Christian values is a misleading map. From his point of view, if you look at the actual territory of the theology, Islam and Judaism are much more similar to each other. They're both what he calls law-based systems, and he argues they have more in common with each other than either of them has with Christianity, which he defines as a system based purely on grace.
And this idea goes way beyond just religion. His theory is that a nation's unique history, its geography, its territory, forges a completely distinct cultural map. This map then becomes this invisible script that dictates a country's deepest instincts, its core values, everything. It's why different cultures react to the same situation in totally different ways.
All right, buckle up, because now we're getting into what is probably the most challenging, most provocative part of his entire worldview. We're going to deconstruct what he calls the modern map of grievance, a map he believes totally misreads how power and history actually work.
So here it is, his central argument on this. He claims that throughout history, domination and exploitation weren't originally motivated by racism. He says they were driven by much more basic human impulses, greed, the lust for power, things like that. Racism, in his view, was what he calls an emergent counter-narrative. It was a story that was invented after the fact to justify the terrible things that were already being done for other reasons.
And he actually traces how these justifications, these maps of domination, evolved over time. First, you had a religious map. We're conquering you to save your souls. Then, that shifted to a secular map. We're conquering you as part of a civilizing mission. And finally, it morphed into a pseudo-scientific map, one that actually created racial hierarchies to make all this inequality seem like it was just the natural order of things.
So all of this analysis leads him to ask a really interesting question, one that kind of turns our usual thinking on its head. In so many modern conflicts, from actual wars like Vietnam to the culture wars at home, why do the groups that look weaker on paper so often end up winning?
And his answer is fascinating. He says the weaker side often wins because they're not even playing the same game. They're using a completely different map. They're not fighting with tanks or money. No, they're fighting on a different battlefield altogether. A battlefield of motivation, of moral storytelling, and of strategically taking over the stronger side's own institutions from the inside.
And this is the absolute crux of his argument right here. In his view, the very things that liberal societies hold up as their highest principles, things like fairness, empathy, equality for all, those principles actually become their biggest vulnerability. They can be turned into weapons and used against them by groups that simply don't play by the same rules.
Okay, so we've torn down the old maps. We've seen why he thinks they're so broken. So, what does he want to build in their place? If the old ways aren't working, what does his new map for the future actually look like?
Well, first off, he argues that one of the most talked about solutions today, financial reparations, is a total dead end. He says, look, not only is it a logistical nightmare that you can never solve, but more importantly, it creates a permanent system that incentivizes people to define themselves by what was done to their ancestors, not by what they can build for their future.
So instead of that, he lays out this four-part strategy. And the key thing to understand here is that it's all about changing the incentives. It's not about forgetting history. It's about making it much more rewarding for people to focus on opportunity, on agency, on debating ideas within their own communities than it is to just make endless claims about the past.
At the end of the day, the goal of this new map he's proposing is to completely shift our cultural gravity. It's about creating a society where building a better future becomes way more compelling, way more interesting, and yeah, even more profitable than fighting over the past.
And that's really what this whole analysis leaves us with. After going through this deep critique of how we see the world, it kind of turns the camera back on us and forces us to ask a really crucial question. What map are you using to navigate the world? And are you sure it's still accurate?